Mansfield.
The games a console launches with are important for two main reasons. One, to draw people in from the very beginning and make sure folks buy the things being sold. And two, because they help to set a standard, to define in the minds of players what it is the console will be known for, how it will be thought about, what people can expect from it throughout its lifespan. That thought being thought about, I thought I'd put together a list of the defining launch games for a bunch of consoles. Note, I don't mean the best launch games, though invariably sometimes they will be the best, just the ones I think, with my big subjective brain, summed up the console in question overall. One housekeeping note. The dates listed are when each game released as a launch title. Some had already come out in other regions, but given how isolated we were around the world in the distant misty past of the 80s and 90s, it wasn't odd to see big differences in what titles would launch alongside a console. Which explains the Golden Axe entry, basically. To the list! There are some games that define the console they're released on to such a degree that are so powerfully linked to the machine, it's almost impossible to think of one without the other. That was definitely the case with Super Mario Bros. And the Nintendo NES Entertainment NES system, NES. Name any other game on the NES. That's right, you can't. Bayou Billy, sit down. But really though, Super Mario Bros. Defined Nintendo's Great Grey Hope, helping the console rise above the generally cruddy reputation video game devices had in North America during the mid-80s. Atari had ruined everything for a few years, but Nintendo near single-handedly fixed it all, and a huge amount of credit has to go the way of the mushroom-slaughtering plumber. Naturally, we don't talk about Japan or Europe in those sorts of terms, as we were all perfectly happy with a healthy and robust gaming market through those years, but let us not digress. Super Mario Bros. Became the game of the 80s. You had to have it if you bought a NES. Handily, the console often came with it anyway, and its mix of smooth scrolling levels, tricky platforming action, and massive consumption of fungus made for an absolute killer app. A brilliant game, not just for the NES itself, but for video games as a whole. Setting out the stall like that, laying things out as a here is what the NES is about, here is what modern console gaming is now going to be, was likely the intention of Nintendo, I'm sure. But nobody at the company could have expected Super Mario Bros. To be as important and influential as it ended up being. Even if the North American gaming market hadn't needed resuscitating in the mid-80s, the arrival of the murderous plumber and his brand spanking new console would still have seen a sea change for the entire industry. Also, there may be some of you screaming bloody murder at this video right now, possibly you've already commented in your best well actually tone, but I know, alright? We don't actually have definitive, dead-set proof that Super Mario Bros. Was launched day and date with the NES in the US, thanks to poor record-keeping in the past and some chicanery with Nintendo adopting a test market launch for the console in 1985, followed by the nationwide launch in 1986. But I'm relying on two things here. One, Nintendo itself lists Mario's NES launch date as the same as that for the console itself. And two, Super Mario Bros. Did launch alongside the NES in Europe, but I haven't included that as the date listed because I'm not entirely sure when the NES did launch in different European countries, and good God, the documentation of gaming history is a farce. Still, Super Mario Bros. Was an all-timer, eh? The joy of this being my own list from my own brain is that if I can't think of something for a console I do think should be included, I can just skip it. That's why, even though this is in chronological order, we've jumped Nintendo to Nintendo because, honestly, the Master System just left me a bit cold. Ah well. Tetris though, eh? Heard of that one? There was a trend through the years following 1989 for gaming devices, especially handhelds, to launch alongside a puzzle game. The Atari Lynx had clacks, columns on Game Gear, even through to the PSP and Vita having versions of Lumines for each launch. It's safe to say this came from Tetris on the Game Boy, because Tetris on the Game Boy absolutely defined that handheld. It was a magnificent implementation of a game plenty were already familiar with by 1989, with the added bonus of being completely portable. It was satisfying and compulsive, lent itself well to challenges with friends, passing the device from one to the next, and just immediately struck a chord in a way that few other Day One games could have. A fair few of the other titles on this list redefined what gaming could be, raised the bar, changed the landscape forever. I don't think Game Boy Tetris did that, but I do think it was an absolutely superb game, genuinely one of the closest to perfect things we're ever likely to see in the world. And it wouldn't have been that way were it not paired so flawlessly with the hardware it launched alongside. Tetris defined the Game Boy to such a degree that the handheld ended up being a one-game machine for plenty of people. That is to say, they bought a device that was capable of playing hundreds of different titles, but only played and only ever intended to play one game on it. Sure, the more enlightened among us saw the Game Boy for what it was, a conduit to the glory of world bowling, but for a not insignificant number of people, Nintendo's portable Joy Machine was quite literally nothing more than a Tetris player. And honestly, there would have been much worse ways to use your Game Boy. Tetris on that machine was a masterpiece. The past being as wacky as it was meant the Mega Drive had already been out in Japan for 2 years before it was officially available in Europe. That might have been a mild form of torture for those of us alive and aware at the time, but if we look at this as the long game, it did lead to me being able to use Golden Axe as a launch game here. A huge victory, we all surely agree. The Mega Drive marked the beginning of a new generation of arcade-to-home ports. We were finally at a point where a home console could produce a convincing facsimile of the games that were blowing our minds in the coin-op world. Golden Axe was imperfect. Next to the arcade original, it was a clear step down. But while we didn't have the arcade original at home in 1990 in Europe, we could finally have the Mega Drive at home, and so, via Golden Axe, we could have the arcade at home. This was the message the Mega Drive was sending throughout its lifetime, even as games, both on Sega's console and elsewhere, made moves away from their often arcade-inspired roots. Golden Axe was the gateway launch title for many a player to see that we were heading in a truly exciting direction towards big, loud, bombastic games in the home that could convincingly emulate coin-ops, and that could do their own thing with gusto too. When you think of the Mega Drive, or yes, the Genesis, do you think of arcadey games? Of course you do. Thanks, Golden Axe. Now, there may be an argument from some that Altered Beast is more worthy of this accolade, itself being a launch title in Europe and the US, and again one based on a popular arcade machine of the day. There's one key difference between the two games that led to my choice though. Altered Beast is pap. Golden Axe is actually good. Oh look, it's Mario again, almost like Nintendo does this stuff intentionally. I have to say, hand on heart, if the SNES had launched with Street Fighter II, that's the game I'd have gone with here, because that's the game that absolutely defined this 16-bit beast. Sadly, the SNES did not launch alongside Street Fighter II, and instead only launched alongside a bunch of games that included Super Mario World, which was only one of the best games ever made, full stop. It's a bold opening gambit, you have to give it to Nintendo. Just like the Mega Drive, the SNES was drowning in good and great games, as well as the odd genuine classic along the way. Had there not been a Super Mario World on the console, would it have played out the same way? Well, yes, most likely. Because the superb Nintendo was home to more than just fantastic platformers and carved quite the historical niche for itself as the home of Japanese RPGs through the 90s. But that's why it all brings it back to my justification here, why Super Mario World defined the SNES as a launch title. It was creative, interesting, took things in unexpected directions, lent itself to repeat play, and felt absolutely like you'd expect a Japanese game in the 90s to feel. What else could I say that about? Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, Zelda: A Link to the Past, Mega Man X, yes, Street Fighter II, any of the Final Fantasies, and plenty of other absolute bangers that came to the SNES throughout its lifetime. Were they all riffing on the Super Mario World formula? Of course not, but the Homicidal Plumber's Super Adventure set the scene, the vibe, for what we could expect on the SNES, and developers were all too happy to sing from the hymn sheet provided. And, you know, it probably helped a bit that Super Mario World was an all-time great. It would take a long time for true arcade perfection to arrive in homes around the world. Unless you were a literal billionaire and could afford a Neo Geo AES. Because it was literally arcade hardware consolified and slapped into your home. And it was very expensive, about 1,200 quid in modern money plus hundreds more per individual game. But again, the Neo Geo was literally arcade hardware in your home that was desirable and worth boasting about if you were fortunate enough to have one in your possession. So what about this game I chose to define the machine? Look, I'll be honest, it could have been any of them that launched with the AES in 1991. They were all Neo Geo arcade games surgically injected into cartridges for you to play in your living room. They all carried the same message as King of the Monsters, which was, hey, this is literally arcade hardware in your home. And guess what? The Neo Geo AES continued down that road its whole life, bringing arcade-perfect titles into your house, which you'd have to remortgage many times over to be able to afford any of them. Yeah, I'm keeping this one in the list. I only liked King of the Monsters as a kid because it was cool seeing big beasties battering each other. These days, it's clunky as hell and I cannot be bothered. But the reasoning behind the pick, yeah, that stands up. Where should I go with this one? Well, how's about Night Trap defined the Mega CD, or Sega CD if you must, in that it was a game with a lot of hype around it initially until it became clear nobody was paying attention to its actual content and it quickly drifted off into nothingness, ready to be forgotten for a couple of decades until people who really should know better dug it up and pretended it was anything more than a rather crap curio. You know, exactly like the Mega CD hardware. I could go that route, but I won't. Because even avoiding the well-worn path of talking about all the nonsense hyperventilating controversy around it and the ratings legacy that Night Trap helped to create in the games industry, I do still think this interactive movie thing defined Sega's tepid CD hardware add-on. See, the game grabbed attention. It was unlike anything we'd seen before, at least on the Mega Drive or SNES, so the core console gaming market of the early 90s. It was backed by a gigantic wall of hype that made it out to be a transformative experience, one which would alter your very perception of what was possible in gaming forever. And, on closer inspection, it was loafers. By that pathetically shoehorned in Simpsons reference, I actually mean, on closer inspection, Night Trap was empty, vapid pap. You know, exactly like the Mega CD hardware. There have been attempts at rehabilitating the hardware's reputation, especially in the past few years, and I agree with the sentiment that given more care and attention from developers who were keen to take clever advantage of the hardware's capabilities rather than just relying on cheap tricks built on the foundations of hefty CD storage capacities, were that the case, we would have seen a much more interesting and dynamic add-on for the Mega Drive. But we didn't. We saw plenty of steaming piles of garbage pumping as many megabytes onto a disk as possible in lieu of actually making memorable, impactful experiences for the player. Night Trap was the game that defined the Mega CD, in that it was a portent of things to come. Was it the mix of pre-rendered 2D sprites and real-time 3D backgrounds, the FMV bits of racers chewing the scenery, the fact it was fine but unspectacular as a game? No, it was something else that made Crash and Burn the 3DO's defining launch game. That something else being it was the only launch game for the 3DO, thus being picked by default. No, I probably didn't have to include it in this list. Ah well, moving on. The other consoles don't count. Sega's Saturn launched the 32-bit era of gaming. CDs, 3Ds, CRT, TVs, whatever, all that stuff. It was an important moment, basically, and one that deserved some big hitters to back up this brand new generation, the first real steps into the bold future of what video games would become. Sega did understand this. Well, that or they knew they had to put big-name games out with the Saturn to help it sell. Either way, it meant the console launched alongside the first home port of the game that had made the 3D fighting genre one that really mattered, Virtua Fighter. This port absolutely defined the Saturn, in my eyes. It brought the arcade to the home. It was an authentic recreation of one of the world's biggest and best gaming companies' biggest and best games. It showed the Saturn would be getting almost everything Sega put out, which was a real reason to be excited in the mid-90s. But none of that's my actual reasoning here. Virtua Fighter might have reviewed well at launch, but it didn't take too long for the rising damp and dry rot in it all to become apparent. The game was glitchy, rushed, light on features, and frankly not as good as it could or should have been to back up the launch of Sega's biggest console to date. When the PlayStation landed with Battle Arena to Shinden, eyebrows were raised. Why did Virtua Fighter look so old and dodgy by comparison? And when Tekken arrived on PS1, forget about it. Basically, Virtua Fighter was rushed to market. It certainly won't have been the developer's choice to do so, but it was still a slap in the face to players. And the game needed to be fixed with Virtua Fighter Remix, which arrived a few months after Virtua Fighter's original release. It summed up what was to come from the Saturn, a mishmash of great games made by truly talented people, but all managed by a company whose left hand didn't even know it had a right hand, never mind what it was doing. Virtua Fighter not the right choice for you? Okay, no worries, I've got another option. Daytona USA, a launch title in Europe. Why was it the second option for the Saturn's defining launch title? Well, Daytona USA was rushed to market. It certainly won't have been the developer's choice to do so, but it was still a slap in the face to players, and the game needed to be fixed with Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, which arrived a year and a bit after Daytona USA's original release. It summed up what was to come from the Saturn, a mishmash of great games made by truly talented people, but all managed by a company whose right leg didn't even know it had a left leg, never mind what it was doing. I do think it's a fair assumption that Virtua Fighter, or Daytona if you're going to go with that as your pick, helped to set a certain perception about the Saturn in its early days, and that perception stuck around for much longer than it probably should have. That being, this was a console weak in the 3D department that couldn't do arcade ports as well as the PlayStation, and that needed do-overs and sequels to actually get things right. It wasn't the world's worst start for a console. It's easy to forget the Saturn did really well when it first launched after all. But that seed of doubt was planted from day one. Watered by Sony's pro-PlayStation propaganda and fed by a doubting games press, it grew into an assumed, accepted truth about Sega's ultimately doomed device. Or maybe I'm being a bit dramatic, I don't know. Either way, day one Virtua Fighter should have been better for the sake of the Saturn. It's always funny to be reminded how knackered things were with Sega in 1994. There was a bit of a gap between Mega Drive Mushroomy add-on the 32X's release in the US and Europe and the subsequent launch of the new-gen full console, the Saturn. It was a brief gap though, and players were annoyed at what they saw as Sega screwing them about. But in Japan, the Saturn came out in November 1994. The 32X came out December 94. Yes, that's after. Great planning and communication between regional officers all round, lads. Anyway, one of the 32X's launch titles was Virtua Racing Deluxe, a fresh port of Sega's premier arcade racer that took advantage of the additional Power Blast chips the add-on brought to the Mega Drive's aging innards. At first glance, it was clearly a step up from the still impressive original Mega Drive port, and while the eventual Saturn version of Virtua Racing did look a lot better than the 32X game, it played a lot worse. Short explanation, wrong developers, no source code to work off, a surprisingly decent port all things considered, but shown up from a pure fun in the game perspective by a massively technologically inferior add-on for an ancient console. Which is why, to me, Virtua Racing Deluxe was the game to define the 32X. It showed that here was an add-on for another console that was capable of pushing out some cracking games and had real potential to perform well if it were taken advantage of to its fullest. The same thing happened with Virtua Fighter's 32X port, which again put the original Saturn port of the same game to shame. The 32X had potential, and if it were tapped, this could have been a genuinely great addition to Sega's hardware library. No, wait, I've just realised I'm completely off here. Doom was another launch title and actually defined the 32X's run with much more clarity, in that it was a wasted effort, didn't take much advantage of the hardware, ran like crap, and set the scene for the add-on's whole run as a huge waste of everyone's time. The more you know. I feel I've talked a lot about Ridge Racer in 2024. Check out some other videos I've done, but It's a legendary game, it's still a hell of a lot of fun, and it absolutely secures its place on this here list of mine for being the launch game to define Sony's original PlayStation. Transformative. With modern eyes, of course, the cracks do show, but in 1994 or 1995 for me here in the UK, Ridge Racer looked stupendously good. I've said similar before, but it bears repeating. It wasn't literally arcade perfect, but it was as good as to those who were coming straight from, in the most part, the SNES and Mega Drive. Ridge Racer was a slap in the face and a wake-up call to show what the future of video games was going to be. Daytona on Saturn made us all think the glorious future of 3D gaming was still a work in progress. Ridge Racer showed us how wrong that thinking was. Did Namco's Racer define the PlayStation in that every game on the console was an arcade racer? No, obviously not, don't be silly. But it defined the expectations players had for the system. On day one, it had brought a superb recreation of a big-name arcade game into the home. What would day 2 bring? Week 3, month 4, year 5. Ridge Racer set expectations for what was to come. Not just for the PlayStation, but in gaming as a whole. But mainly on the PlayStation, because that's the point of this list. I'd say there's a strong argument for Wipeout to get the nod here, with the future Hover Racer launching alongside the PS1 in Europe. Psygnosis' game absolutely set Sony up to dictate how the world outside gaming would perceive the PlayStation. Wipeout's what made video games cool through the mid to late 90s is what I'm saying, and that attitude carried the original PlayStation through its whole lifespan. If your headcanon says Wipeout's the pick here, I won't argue. But for me, Ridge Racer gets the nod. It was a sea change after the expense of the Neo Geo and the disappointment of the Saturn's initial rushed arcade ports. Everyone could finally have that, air quotes, arcade perfect game in the home. From that point on, the PS1 was off and running, and even if it won't be remembered as the console home to the best arcade ports in general, the PlayStation never lost the swagger bestowed on it by its defining launch game, Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer! By the third Mario game in this list, you might be thinking, diminishing returns, this will be the point where Nintendo fumbled things. You'd be wrong. The 64th game in the Mario series for Nintendo's 64th console was among the first true 3D platformers, and to this day is still one of the absolute best. It's one of those games, like your Street Fighter 2s, your Dooms, your Grand Theft Auto 3s, that changed the landscape forever, resulting in countless clones and copycats trying to ride the coattails and live off just some of the glory by association that comes with sitting at the same table as the master, or even just standing in the same building as it. Mario 64 was a game changer, basically. But it pulled double duty by also defining the N64 and the console's entire run. And I think it's fair to say not really in the most helpful way. See, when you launch alongside one of the best games ever made, then a certain level of expectation is set. Whether it's fair or not, realistic or unrealistic, the fact is when you come off the blocks that fast and strong, people expect your level of performance to maintain. The N64 had a hell of a lot of incredible games. In fact, the N64 did have, to my mind, 2 further game-changing bar raisers in GoldenEye and Ocarina of Time. But I would say the N64 never quite lived up to the initial pang of promise that came with its arrival alongside Super Mario 64, at least not in the same way the SNES did with Super Mario World. It was a beloved console, sure, but there's always been the feeling in my mind the N64 was ultimately a bit of a missed opportunity. Mario 64 led us to believe we were destined for greatness, but instead we got mere very goodness. And yes, I'm aware I've found a way to turn an undeniably huge positive into a little bit of a negative. It's my superpower. Mario 64 was ace. There's your list. You don't have to agree with it, but my patrons on Patreon do. They'll all know this because they read the full terms and conditions. You can join them at the link below. I'm off to barricade my house to stop the hordes of angry Saturn fans trying to break in and kneecap me for telling the truth. Bye!